Friday. Welcome back to In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com, or welcome in if this happens to be your first time joining us. We're welcome to have each and every one of you, whether you're a first-time viewer, a 46th time viewer, since this is our 46th episode. All are welcome on In Touch with Indiana Sports, and glad to have you. Hope you've had yourself a great week. I'll tell you what, I had a great Thursday night last night, at least when you consider the fact that, you know, I've referenced my fantasy football team every now and again. Freaking Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase combining to give me nearly 90 fantasy points. I mean, come on, baby. I'm 8-1, looking to go 9-1. For those of you who've been following along since the beginning, you're probably still aware that I've never done fantasy football until this year, but I'll take a little beginner's luck, if that's what you want to call it. You know, in the back of my mind, I like to pretend it's just me being that good. But nonetheless, feeling good after that. Hopefully the rest of my fantasy team will prevail for me. And yeah, some good stuff. A great show on Wednesday with Ant Wright. For those of you who tuned in to the live edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports, some of you maybe watched the replay of it, and that's totally fine too. But we wanted to give people something different. And hopefully that went well for those of you who were able to watch and, you know, take in that kind of different style of episode. And I think the goal with shows like that in the future are going to be to do maybe a live show once a month. And then, you know, it's just a ballpark. It's not necessarily something that, you know, is set in stone or concrete or anything, but the idea is to potentially do a live show every so often with a special guest and just kind of offer something a little bit different. Also, while we're talking shows, post-game show, not Louisville, I say Louisville because I also work for a Louisville sports station where I live. Indiana football post-game wrap-up show will be back tomorrow evening. I believe Dylan Traeger is going to join me again. I don't know that for sure. But either way, we're going to have somebody to chat with me about all that happens in Indiana football's their chase for their 10th win, man. 10 wins, something that's never been done in Indiana football history. And, you know, it's very exciting. I mean, somebody told me yesterday that as an Indiana fan, and not that they were saying that I'm not doing this, but to keep doing this more so. That's just live in the moment. Enjoy this season because we don't really know if we'll ever get to experience something like this again. And I happen to think that maybe we will, especially as long as Curt Cignetti is here. I think there's no reason to think that he shouldn't be able to replicate this, right? I mean, we talked about it during the offseason. We've continued to talk about it as he's proven it so far with Indiana in year one, but he's a winner. He's never had a losing season. He's had some up and down years where, you know, instead of winning 11, 12 games, he only wins 6. And again, it's even been a while, I think, since he's had a season where he had that small amount of success. But one thing I think we'll never have to worry about as long as Cignetti is at the helm is that I don't know if a losing season is really ever going to be in the cards for Indiana football, which is not what we're used to. And while we're talking about Cignetti and keeping him around, I guess I might as well go ahead and bring up this little piece of information that I had in my notes. For those of you who may have missed it, and thankfully I saw this yesterday, Florida has decided that they are going to retain Billy Napier after, you know, for at least one more season. And as I've mentioned several times so far this year, the one job that kind of worried me when it comes to if it became available, will Cignetti make the jump to that position? It was the Florida job. And if you look around the rest of college football, there's not really a lot of, you know, tier 1, even tier 2 college football openings or, you know, jobs that will be opening this offseason. And, you know, real quick, I know you've heard me clear my throat a few times already this episode, and I can feel it coming on a third time. And I'm going to mute my microphone for a second. Got to get all of this nasty phlegm out of my system so I can continue and not think about it. So let me do that real fast. There we go. Man, I hate doing that. And I don't want to sit there and dwell on it, but again, It's something that bothers me. But hey, that's life. That's why I've got this handy dandy coffee. Not drinking Americano today, just drinking a regular home brewed coffee, and it's getting the job done. And I'll tell you what, if you want to hear more about what that Americano did to me in throughout the rest of the day in terms of the energy level, check out this week's episode of Out of Touch with Mitchell Page and myself. Again, the whole episode is full of nonsense, things about our lives, and just kind of us in having a good time. We recorded it on Tuesday, released it on Thursday, and if you want to check that out, it's available on the Out of Touch Media YouTube page, or you can find it the Out of Touch podcast on Spotify. But again, talking about the Florida job no longer opening, I think there's a really good chance that even though Cignetti will still need to be paid a significant amount, when it comes to kind of Indiana, the administration showing Cignetti that they are committed to him and the longevity at Bloomington and the staff and all that good stuff, I do think you're going to see some sort of pay raise from the IU administration. But I don't think there's any job at this point that could open up that would be enticing enough for Curt Cignetti to just hop up and leave Bloomington after one season. And another thing to keep in mind, he's already old. And I know that sounds like an insult, but he's already in the final stage of his professional career. You can imagine he's 63, 64 years old, something like that. So him being at the age that he is, he gets far enough into his tenure at Indiana. I doubt that he'll want to restart somewhere else. Maybe I'm wrong. Well, that also, in some cases, makes it less enticing for other programs to want him. But, depending on how sustainable this is with Indiana, it won't matter his age, though, right? Because if he continues to have unprecedented success levels with Indiana throughout however many years he is here, it won't matter. People will want him no matter what. I've already seen a few Florida message board folks, whatever you want to call them, mentioning that he's the next Nick Saban, which is, I hate to, it's kind of like whenever I would make that comparison saying Curtis Rourke kind of plays like Tom Brady. It's kind of like when you say something like that, you have to take a few steps back and think about what you're really saying, of course. But he is a student of Nick Saban's. He was on his original staff back at the early years of him being in Alabama. And Cignetti's gone on record saying that he kind of runs his ship, so to speak, in the same manner in which Nick Saban would run things. He was very process-oriented at Alabama, the same way that it apparently is now at Indiana. So, and I'm sure there's plenty of people thinking there's no way that Indiana deserves somebody that is similar to the likes of one Nick Saban, correct? So they'll just, I know I've got a lot of things to say about this coaching stuff because I keep thinking of other points, and I do have one last point that I'm going to eventually get to. But when it comes to the Alabama job specifically, imagine if this is 1 year earlier and Nick Saban decides to retire this season instead of last season. I genuinely think Indiana would be in big trouble. I don't see any scenario where if Nick Saban, if the job opens up, if the Alabama job opens up this season and Indiana's having the year they're having now, I don't see any scenario where it's not Cignetti that takes the job instead of Kalen DeBoer. But again, that happened last year, so that's not anything that anyone genuinely has to worry about. Now, getting to my final point that I wanted to mention when it comes to the Cignetti, saga, whatever you want to call it, potentially losing him. There is one other job that's kind of really off the radar for really any elite head football coach, except for those who are near and dear to this specific program, I would think, and that is West Virginia and Neil Brown. Now, I don't think Neil Brown will necessarily get fired this season, but if he continues to have a downward trend that he's had over the last couple of seasons, it wouldn't surprise me if the West Virginia vacancy opens up. And somebody may be thinking, well, why would West Virginia be an issue? Well, there's really only one reason. And it's the fact that Curt Cignetti is an alum of West Virginia, was quarterback there from 79 to 82. And he's also in cahoots. This is kind of two reasons, I guess. He's also real big buddies with Pat McAfee, who also went to West Virginia. And I know they've kind of been like, McAfee's been propping him up and staying in Indiana long term. But it also wouldn't surprise me if back in the back of Pat McAfee's mind, if there was an opportunity for Curt Cignetti to go back to his alma mater, he'd be pushing for it, would he not? But there's also the thought that, or not even the thought, but like the truth of the matter, the fact that West Virginia's in the Big 12, which is probably at this point the weakest of the Power 4 conferences, at least this season. Maybe that doesn't mean a whole lot. But again, it's hard for me to see any coach that's already in the Big 10 or the SEC making a jump to a program that's in any other conference other than those two. And I'm talking about on their own accord. If you get fired, that's one thing. But maybe Cignetti would do that for his alma mater. And again, just wanted to throw some of those things out there just because of the news yesterday that Billy Napier was going to be retained in Florida. And therefore, there's not going to be a whole lot of big jobs open this offseason when it comes to college football, but that can only mean good things when it comes to Indiana and hoping to retain Curt Cignetti. Excuse me. Let's take another swig of coffee real quick. Apologies. I don't mean to have some of these long pauses. Let's do that one more time. I don't know why. Maybe I got an issue going on, or maybe it's all in my head, right? But again, after the little throat clear, things get cleared right up, I guess. All right, before we get into some more football talk, and by the way, when we do talk more football, I'm going to bring in Jordan Eggleston. He's one of the members of the Eyes on Big podcast. We usually bring on Jeffrey the Greek from the Eyes on Big, and there's also Big Kurt. But I've decided to bring on Jordan Eggleston this week because he himself is a Michigan fan, very close to the Michigan program. And he and I had a really good discussion about the game this weekend, hearing his thoughts on really from a Michigan perspective. In his eyes, what is he seeing with Indiana football? How are they able to do all this? And also, why are things going wrong with Michigan? How has Sharon Moore been so off the mark so far this year? So, and get into all of that and more, talking Indiana football with him. Also, we'll get into our picks of the week towards the end. And also, because we didn't do it on Wednesday because of the live show, we'll do our non-revenue shout-outs to wrap up things here on a Friday. But before we do any of that, I do want to talk a little bit more about Indiana basketball because I haven't had a chance to mention on this show, reflecting on what happened in game one. But we did do our post-game wrap-up show on HoosierIllustrated.com. And those are a little bit shorter than the football post-game wrap-up shows just because there's going to be so many more of them. And so, those would be more like little bite-sized little videos for you to consume. We'll still continue to do those live the same way in which we do the football post-game wrap-ups, but they're more than likely going to be shorter little pieces, just of recaps when it comes to those games. But want to go ahead and share some of my thoughts just in general, I guess maybe expanded thoughts since we did initially react to what happened on Wednesday evening. Excuse me. But Indiana opens 1-0. They get a 19-point win. And it was really outside of Mackenzie Mbako. And maybe we should start with Mackenzie Mbako because he put in clearly his best performance so far of his career. And that's something that you should be extremely excited about that if you're an Indiana fan and the potential of, what is going to be the ceiling for Mackenzie Mbako. I think you could argue that after one game that his ceiling may have risen with what he can do with the Hoosiers this year. And of course, before he even played a game with Indiana last year, he was somebody that was considered to have a really high draft stock or eventually going to have a really high draft stock. And I think he took a big step forward with that, with his 31.9 rebound performance against SIU-Edwardsville on Wednesday. Is he going to end up being the de facto player for Indiana basketball this year? Is he going to be the guy that the team relies on whenever there's a big bucket needed on the line. That remains to be seen. I think there could be a number of guys where you could say, depending on what's needed, is it a bucket in the paint, or is it a three-pointer, or is it somebody slashing into the basket? It could be a number of guys. I think there will be moments where you can also argue that Malik Renew is going to end up being the guy you rely on down the stretch. Could be Umar Ballo, could be Miles Rice. And I think that's one of the strengths of this team. Somebody say it's a weakness because you don't have, maybe a definitive go-to guy in the situation. But I don't think you necessarily need one whenever you could have multiple guys. And you can argue Indiana football has that, right? There are so many receivers that Curtis Rourke can go to, and they're reliable enough pass catchers to where you don't really feel like he needs to be going to any one particular receiver. And if Indiana basketball has that same problem, if you will, it's not really a problem. It's a good problem to have, I feel like. Then I think you'll be in good shape moving forward. But definitely a good step in the right direction for Mackenzie Mbako. And I think we're going to see a lot of good things out of him this year. And I think there's also a chance that he ends up being your best player. I know a lot of people have talked about that being maybe a Malik Renew, Umar Ballo, maybe even a Miles Rice. And all three of those, like I mentioned, could be the case. But I don't think we can leave out Mackenzie Mbako in that conversation, especially after what we saw in game one. And he mentioned too that, he's tried really hard at working on his defense this offseason and mentioning how defense turns into offense. And good on him. And hopefully many players are following suit when it comes to that. And if they continue to see him succeed at the high level in which he did in game one, then maybe you'll see more of that from, other players and, things like that moving forward. Hoosiers will be back in action on Sunday, taking on Eastern Illinois on Big Ten Plus. I'm already sick of the Big Ten Plus nonsense. And I know we really haven't had to deal with it much this year. I know we had Hoosier Hysteria on Big Ten Plus, I believe. And then we're also going to have this game. But thankfully, it's the only time for Indiana men's basketball that we're going to have to deal with Big Ten Plus. And also we had the exhibition game. Forgot about Marion being on Big Ten Plus. Even just saying Big Ten Plus over and over again is starting to get on my nerves. So I think I'll just move on from that. But I want to moved back more into kind of the issues from the other night too. And that was just really the sloppy play in primarily the first half. It did continue a little bit into the second half as well. Of course, we saw them clean some things up and really pull away the way that they were supposed to late in the second half, but they did not cover. And I guess one thing I should say this about covering the spread, especially for starting the year. I mean, whenever these Vegas odds makers are really creating, what are you basing it off of? It's just roster potential, right? So I don't think it's the worst thing in the world that Indiana was unable to cover. They were able to pull away and win by a significant margin. It's much better than the situation you were in last year, where in the first couple of games where you were winning games by only a couple of possessions. That's not the situation they found themselves in against SIU-Edwardsville. And I'd be surprised to see if they find themselves in that situation in these other low-tier non-conference games moving forward. That would be a good step in the right direction if you're Mike Woodson and the rest of the squad moving into the rest of the year. And of course, we're really not going to learn a ton about this team until we get to the battle for Atlantis. As you heard me talking with Ant Wright on Wednesday, Indiana does face a Power 4 opponent before they go to Atlantis, but it is a South Carolina team that I learned on. I didn't look at the scores until later on, but Ant Wright brought to my attention that South Carolina lost a bye game to open their season. And I'm trying to remember who the opponent was here. I'm trying to pull it up right now. But yeah, South Carolina in their season opener, they lost to North Florida at home 74-71. I'm trying to see if they played since then. No, they play tonight against South Carolina State. Then they'll face Towson before coming on the road to face the Hoosiers in Assembly Hall. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that based on the early return of that result right there to North Florida, and maybe, we don't know, maybe North Florida will be a good, mid-level team that maybe gets an auto bid from their league to the NCAA tournament. But you still don't want to fall victim to those teams if you're anybody like South Carolina, and especially in Indiana, that caliber of a team, of course. But I think Indiana, even when they face South Carolina, we're not going to learn a ton about how good this team actually is. So moving forward, if you're the Hoosiers, the best thing you can do for your team's kind of national outlook is just take care of business until you get to Atlantis. And that begins with Eastern Illinois on Sunday. You have South Carolina 6 days later. You have UNC Greensboro after that. And then beginning on November 27th, you'll have your 3-game stretch where you'll face Louisville to tip things off in the battle for Atlantis. And then you'll face either Gonzaga or Arizona. And then, it could be a number of teams in that third game, depending on how things have shaped up for you in your first 2 matchups. So a mixed bag for Indiana men's basketball to start the season. And we'll continue to, monitor all of that moving forward. We'll check in with Kyler Staley now and again. We'll reconnect with Alec. I know we didn't do a segment with Alec Lasley this week because of the special episode on Wednesday, but a lot of good. I still think there's a lot of things to be excited about. I don't want to come away from this Indiana basketball discussion seeming like I'm doom and gloom about the program. I just do think there is a lot of questions, especially we didn't really see a lot of, I don't want to say we were promised a change in play, but let me go ahead and address this really quick now that I'm diving into it head first. A lot of people want to see Indiana become this 3-point shooting machine where, Luke Goody's hitting 5 threes a night and Trey Galloway's back to shooting the way that he was a few years ago. I don't think we're going to see that. I think Indiana's still going to be fairly paint-oriented. There's going to be some moments, some games here and there where I do think you see them being more successful with the 3-ball. But I think ultimately we're not going to see a vast change in style of play when it comes to what Mike Woodson wants to do on the floor. And also, here's the other thing with that. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because here's my perspective on it. If your style of play is difficult for your opponent and you're able to execute with what you want to do, then you win the game, right? The problem is whenever somebody else is able to dictate their style of play against Indiana, that's what you want to do. You want to be the more dominant, you want to dictate pace, if you will. That might be the best way to say it. And not all of it is pace oriented, of course. But I'm not somebody who necessarily has a problem with, relying on bigs down low, because if that works and you're able to do what you need to do, then I don't see an issue with it. Now, you do want to have good shooters whenever it's time to rely on that sort of thing. Shout out to the scam caller. I'm not sure if you're able to hear that in the microphone, but I just got a scam caller come through, and now it's time for me to lower my ringer so that doesn't bother me again while I'm doing this show. But when it comes to back to that style of play stuff, we were talking about 3-point shooting, right? Indiana doesn't need to shoot 1 million threes a game, but they need to be taking more than they were last year, and they need to be getting better looks. And I do think they have better shooters on their team this year, and I think that's ultimately going to be the difference between success and not having success, is whether or not the 3-point shooting can complement what you're doing down low, because that's the issue Indiana ran into in the last season specifically, and a little bit in seasons prior. So I'll leave it at that when it comes to where we're at with Indiana basketball. And we'll, of course, revisit it more on Monday, talk with Kyler Staley about everything that goes on with that. And I don't know if we'll do a post-game wrap-up with him or if it'll be me chatting with him on Monday. But we'll react to what happens on Sunday, next Monday, whenever it comes to the Eastern Illinois matchup. Hopefully they clean up some things, look a little more sharper around the perimeter. And we'll leave it at that. So without further ado, let's go ahead and bring in our special guest of the day, Mr. Jordan Eggleston from the Eyes on Big podcast. Great conversation. Looking forward to sharing that with you here in just a second. So right now, bringing on from the Eyes on Big podcast, it is Jordan. Joining me now on In Touch with Indiana Sports, it's not Jeffrey the Greek, it's not Big Kurt. It is the third member of the Eyes on Big podcast. It is Jordan Eggleston. First of all, I'm super happy to have you on. appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk some Indiana-Michigan football. I'm very excited about the weekend coming up with this game specifically, and just welcome into the podcast, my man.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'd like to consider myself just the odd third wheel of the Eyes on Big podcast, kind of stepping in for Kurt in his absences, but it's been fun. Enjoy it. And I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about this game this weekend.
Well, you do a great job, and I love the way that each of you all break down really your thoughts on all the games. And of course, I'm bringing you on specifically this week because you are someone who is very close with the Michigan program. You're a fan, and it's a very interesting kind of situation we have coming up this Saturday, really, where you probably expected the teams to have opposite records. Maybe Michigan fans expected to be 9-0, and maybe Indiana fans would have been happy with a 5-4 record. But this is something that I don't think anybody predicted, specifically with the Hoosiers and maybe with the Wolverines as well. But what are kind of just your overall, or I guess initial thoughts on maybe where you see this game going and kind of what's on the line? There's just so much that we could dive into, but I do just want to kind of get your initial thoughts on it in general.
Yeah, I got to tell you, this Michigan fan didn't think Michigan was going to be 9-0. I knew that there was some flaws coming in with this team this season. Absolutely. I didn't think it would look this bad, full disclosure. But no, I think this game is interesting. Me and Jeff kind of talked last night on Eyes on Big podcast, which is out now. If you haven't listened yet, it's posted live. So take a listen to that. It's an interesting game because, all the talk about Indiana is, they haven't played anybody. And it's like we say on there, and we've been saying all season, like, it doesn't truly matter that they haven't, quote unquote, played anybody because they've been routing everybody that they've played. So at some point, like, how you handle the game and how you handle those opponents has to matter because you can only play the schedule that's in front of you. And I've been sending messages and telling everybody that this game and this Indiana team terrifies me because they just don't seem to make mistakes. And that's the thing, in these bigger games and these higher matchup games, you look to what team's going to make the most mistakes, and that's generally how it's going to happen. And if you had to ask me right now, I trust Indiana to not make those mistakes as much as what Michigan has made. So,
and it is weird.
Kind of scary.
We have seen Indiana finally face a little bit of adversity, at least when you saw them beat down 10-0 against Michigan State. But when you think about the way they responded, I don't think you could have asked for anything better, given that you were in a true road environment. I mean, Michigan State had all the momentum. You seemingly could not stop somebody like Nick Marsh, but Cignetti's squad really had the Hoosiers ready to just kind of mow them over, as they ended up doing. So it'll be interesting to see how Indiana matches up with Michigan, because on paper, Michigan should be the more talented team, right? Because they bring in all the guys. They should have all the, NIL support to be able to get whoever they want, because they're Michigan football. They're one of the traditional powerhouses, of course, of the Big Ten. But that doesn't necessarily always translate to success on the field if all of the pieces don't mesh well together. Specifically, it seems like the offense from Michigan has been one of the most glaring issues for the Wolverines. What do you think has kind of led them, maybe that is it, to kind of the struggles this year?
Well, and I think the big thing that I've been saying all season is Michigan has a lot of great players. They're just not a good team. There's a lot of NFL talent on this team. I've seen some mock drafts that have as many as 5 guys getting taken in the first round. So it's not a talent issue. They're just not a great team. They're not very well coached. They don't play well together. And that kind of really summarizes itself into the offense and that offensive line. There's some talented players on Michigan's offensive line, but they can never seem to put 4 quarters together. They'll play a good quarter where there won't be a whole lot of missed assignments, and then they'll play 2 more right after that where it's got awful and guys are running free and there's blown assignments, linemen literally tripping over each other. So it just goes back to there's a lot of great players. They're just not a good team. They don't gel well together. And at this point, 9 games into the season, I think you kind of have to throw out the window. They're probably not going to ever be a good team this year. So you have to try to find something that works and stick to it and try to lean on it. I don't know what it is. I hope that Sharon Moore and these guys that are getting paid millions of dollars can figure out what it is, because we do have some pretty tough games, including this weekend.
I'll ask you about Sharon Moore in a minute, because I did mention something at the very beginning of the year that I didn't think Sharon Moore was necessarily going to work out in Michigan. I guess I'm going and getting into it now that I've already gone down this path. And it's not that I think he's
just go with it, right?
And it's not that I think he's a bad coach. I just think it's kind of the easy way out when you have somebody, especially who's a national championship winner. It's like, okay, let's just hand the reins off to the coach in waiting. Even if it's somebody who doesn't really have, the pedigree, they've never been a head coach before, that type of a thing. And to just throw him into a program as well known and traditionally powered as Michigan, that's a lot of responsibility. And yeah, he had some moments last year when Jim Harbaugh was suspended and that type of a thing. But for some reason, I don't know what it was, I just had an inkling that Michigan was going to kind of struggle moving away from the Jim Harbaugh era.
Well, I think, and this maybe is a hot take, Sharon Moore is going to have a little bit of a leash because that was a very Michigan thing to do, to just promote from within. I mean, they've done it pretty much my entire lifetime, besides when they went to Rich Rod and got away from it to do the Brady Hoke Rich Rod thing. But it's always been internal. Gary Moeller, Lloyd Carr, all those guys going back in the day, there were always guys that were around and on the staff. So we'll see. Sharon's thing is he's a recruiter, and he's starting to recruit pretty well on the trail right now. So he's going to have a long leash. That's another Michigan thing. But my hot take with this whole thing is I don't think Jim Harbaugh would have been successful with this team. They would have been better. They would have been more successful. But the holes that are on this team were always going to be there when you have all the players leave that did leave. So it's the easy way out, absolutely. But it's also just very Michigan and how they did it.
And back to kind of the issues of the offense. The quarterback position specifically has been a rotating cast of characters this year with Davis Warren, Alex Orji, even Jack Tuttle before he decided to finally hang it up. Who do you like, I guess, the best of the three? And what do you think has led to this issue with Michigan?
What's led to this issue is that they whiffed in recruiting for quarterbacks. I mean, that's what led to it. They went all in on Dante Moore a couple years ago, completely missed, and they set themselves up in a spot where they didn't have an heir apparent to when JJ left, which we all knew he was leaving. As far as right now and in the moment, I think you have to go with Davis Warren because he has been the only guy to show some competence in a passing game. We don't know if Alex Orji can throw the ball, but obviously the coaches don't think he can throw the ball because they have not given him any potential opportunities to do it. He didn't turn it over when he was in there, and to Davis Warren's credit, he has cut back on that drastically since he's been renamed the starter. So we've seen strides from Davis Warren where you can be at least not completely inept passing the ball, which is what Michigan has been the early part of the year. So I think you go with Davis Warren and you sprinkle in some Alex Orji packages, kind of like what they have been. That's your best recipe. But going forward in the future, it's going to be transfer portal heavy until they get the recruit in that they want at quarterback.
Whenever it comes to this matchup against Indiana, what do you see Michigan doing well against the Hoosiers, and how do you see them struggling?
I think this game, to me, it's going to come down to how well Indiana's offensive line handles Michigan's defensive line, because that's truly the only place Michigan defensively has been consistent. Those front four, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, very good players. All of those guys will be in the NFL. They've really been the only ones who have been consistent. So if Indiana's offensive line can at least control that a little bit and allow the running game for Indiana to take hold, that's what worries me. So Michigan's got to win there. Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, they've got to win up front. They've got to try to limit the Indiana running game because everything I've seen from this Indiana offense is they get this running game going, lanes open up, and then the teams try to load up to take it away, and then Curtis Work picks them apart. So they've got to win up front. They've got to win up front with 4 and 5 guys. They can't be trying to put extra resources in the box to slow this Indiana rushing attack down because they're going to get dashed. So look for 0, 55, 78, and 8. Those are the 4 numbers on the Michigan defensive line. If those guys are winning early, then I think Michigan has a chance to stay in this game.
Okay, interesting. So let me ask you this. As somebody who is used to watching championship caliber football, obviously Indiana fans are not used to this type of a season, and they hope that it happens for many years to come. I don't know if they're going to be able to hold on to somebody like a Kurt Cignetti. I know they're going to have to give him some sort of bag this offseason because you know that every tier 1 coaching job that opens up is going to be reaching out to Kurt Cignetti. But from your perspective, as you watch, if you see what Indiana has been in the past, what do you feel like Cignetti's been able to do differently that's just made this team what it is this year?
To me, it just seems like they believe and they trust in what he's doing. He seems to me, and I don't know a whole lot about him as far as a coach and X's and O's, but from what I see with this Indiana team, they're extremely disciplined. They play well together as a unit. They understand where their strengths and weaknesses are as a team, and that's coaching. So that's the players believing in what the coach is selling to them and telling them, hey, you guys maybe it's a chip on the shoulder thing. I don't know exactly what he sells to them, but whatever he tells these guys and however he portrays it, they believe it. They buy into it, they see it, and it shows on the field. Because even then they were down 10-0 last week to Michigan State. You would have looked at that sideline and you couldn't have told. There was no idea that was the case. They all looked just fine. They looked completely comfortable, and it showed. And that obviously was the case as they rattled off 47 in a row. But it just seems like they believe in him. They trust him. They understand that, hey, he knows what he's doing, and we have to follow him. And that's a powerful thing to have in a coach, to have players that buy into you and believe in you, because then it just makes everything else that much easier.
And it is very interesting because we did see kind of a glimpse of that during the Tom Allen era, where the LEO thing, that little shtick, was working. Even though it was just a little shot in the dark, that was something that the players bought into it until it just didn't work. That is something that has always been in the back of my mind this season, just because, again, that was so recent. And part of me's always thought, well, this isn't just a different flavor of kind of the Tom Allen momentum, is it? Because and there's two totally different ways to think about it, right? Because that was during the COVID era. You did have the season before that where they were also 8-4. So there was some momentum from 19 to 20. But I think the biggest difference, and you've hit on this already too, with Indiana this year, is that they're not a fluky 9-0. They've found ways to completely dismantle and demolish teams. And I do think they're finally getting at least some of the respect that they deserve when it comes to the rankings. Some people would argue otherwise. I will say this. I appreciate Joel Klatt going to bat for the Hoosiers on his.
He went hard. He went hard in the paint for him. Absolutely.
And I know he's somebody that, I don't want to say he's forced to kind of side with the Big Ten teams. And I know he's, Fox affiliated, and sometimes you do get some of those biases, but I will say this, when it comes to the rankings, the one gripe I have is when you compare Indiana and Penn State. And I know they've already played Ohio State. Indiana's going to play Ohio State, of course. And that, this will eventually work itself out. But I feel like Penn State is going to end up getting more of a benefit of the doubt for that loss than potentially Indiana would. And again, I know I'm getting ahead of myself because that game is still 3 weeks away. You have Michigan and then the bye and then that. But just found myself going down that rabbit hole because I don't want to see that end up happening, but it is, there is the chance that ends up being the case, of course.
Like I said, we just talked about it a little bit last night on the Eyes on Big podcast. I totally agree. I would have actually thought Indiana should have been maybe 6 right behind Texas with the initial ranking, just strictly based on numbers and everything. But you're right, it is going to work itself out. And I agree with you. If Indiana loses to Ohio State by 10, it's going to be completely blown out of proportion. Like, see, they didn't have a shot. Now, if they hang in there and it's a 3-point loss, then maybe then that loss doesn't really weigh as much. But then they go in there and win that game. Now you're going to see some real interesting people in the committee, because if you have an Indiana team that upsets this Ohio State quote-unquote juggernaut that they're number 2 in the country, it'll be really interesting to see what the committee does with them then, because at that point, there is no argument. There is no ground to stand on that they can't be right behind Oregon at that number 2 spot. So,
and that's the thing, because Indiana has – sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Indiana does have, that route, even though they're being disrespected now. But there's no reason that, because in the committee's eyes, Ohio State and Oregon are 2-1, you have the opportunity to control your destiny, beat both of those teams, one being in the Big Ten championship if you make it. And what's weird to think about, you're the de facto number 1 team in the country if you do that. And I'm not saying Indiana's going to do that. It is just very weird to know that is a potential position for Hoosier football right now.
There's a reason we play the games. They're not done on paper. There's a reason you got to go out there and play for 60 minutes between the lines, because you don't know. You don't know. In today's game, the parity this has been the closest thing to 2007 that we've seen. There's absolutely nothing in my mind that says that that's impossible. It's a real probability.
I've been enjoying the ride, Jordan, and I appreciate you coming on. I do want to ask you one more thing before we wrap up. Just overall, absolutely. I don't need a score prediction. You can give me one if you want, but what do you think will end up happening in Bloomington this weekend?
So this was our game of the week on the Eyes on Big podcast. So it was the last game we hit to for the week, and we talked for a little bit, kind of different scenarios and how we thought this game played out. Both of us picked Indiana to win the game. I did say that I thought this game was going to have points, because I do think initially that Michigan will have a little bit of success and maybe they catch a little bit of points early on in this game. But at the end of the day, like I said, when we kind of started, I feel like in these kind of games, the teams that make the least amount of mistakes and play the cleanest game are going to win these games. And to this point, Indiana's done that in spades, and Michigan's done nothing but crap down their leg when they get into those moments. So I don't see a reason why Indiana doesn't win this game. Now, obviously, it's possible Michigan comes in there and win. They are still a very talented team. They just have to put together 60 minutes. So I think Indiana wins this game. Being at home helps massively, too. I have to imagine that Bloomington's going to be rocking for this game. So you have to imagine the atmosphere is going to be good in their favor. So I think Indiana wins it. I think we have a good game. I believe I said last night 30-24 Hoosiers. Okay. Don't quote me exactly on that, but I think that's kind of the number I landed
Listen to Eyes on Big for their entire thoughts on it.
Absolutely. If you want the full breakdown, you got to go hit the Eyes on Big pod. But I believe it was like 30-24. But I do think points. I think if you're a gambling person, I like the over in this game.
Okay. Good to know. All right, Jordan, appreciate your time. Good to meet you, at least via screen for the first time.
Right.
We talk all sorts of Big Ten stuff, usually on the weekends with a bunch of other Big Ten dudes. But appreciate your time. Maybe we'll do this again down the road when if Indiana, Michigan inevitably play again in the future. But until then, check out the Eyes on Big podcast, and appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me again. And like you said, check out the Eyes on Big podcast, myself and Jeffrey the Greek. And every once in a while, Big Kurt gets back on. We talk all things Big Ten football. So it's not just Indiana. It's not just Michigan. It's the whole conference. It's a smorgasbord of football all weekend. So
big shout out, as always, to those at the Eyes on Big podcast. And big thanks to Jordan Eggleston for taking some time to talk about Indiana, Michigan coming up this Saturday at 3:30. And I'm excited. I hope you're excited, because history in the making for this Indiana football program, right? And like I said at the beginning, let's live in the moment. Let's enjoy this, because will we ever see this again with the Indiana football program? I hope so. But really, it's difficult for even the elite programs. Like, they don't get to the summit that they want to achieve as often as they'd like to. I mean, you see Ohio State. Their season comes down to whether or not they can beat Michigan every year. At least it seems like it. That's how it happens. And then after that, it's if they miss the playoff, everything's a failure. I will say this. As much as I wish Indiana had more success over the years, it is a lot more fun to be able to enjoy an Indiana football season and realize that, you know what? It's not the end of the world if we go 11-1 as opposed to 12-0, right? But of course, I mean, now that we see the position that Indiana's in, we'd love to see them do the ultimate and get to that college football playoff and potentially make some noise and even bring home some hardware if they can do that. But let's just enjoy it. I'm enjoying it. I'm sure you're enjoying it too. And I look forward to checking out how this game plays out on Saturday afternoon and evening. All right, let's get into our picks of the week. And so I've got my betting picks. They're not in front of me at this very second. They're on my phone, as they usually are. I'm going to go through the Big Ten slate, and spoiler alert real quick, none of my betting picks this week really involve Big Ten teams except for one, and I'll mention that whenever I get to it. The rest of them, I kind of went through the slate last night and decided, what do I like? And basically what I'm going to do is I'll let you know what I parlayed together. I made a few different parlays. Feel free to do it in any, bet at your own discretion as always, but, you don't feel like you have to do exactly what I say. And I'm sure many of you who are grown adults know that. But I do like to make that clear. What I say is not gospel. As a matter of fact, it usually isn't. I'm on a pretty cold streak when it comes to some of my college football betting, but nonetheless, it's still fun, and I'm hoping for a bounce back this week. So we'll get to that here in a moment. But I want to go through the Big Ten football slate this week and let you know what I think may happen in each game. Starting off tonight, we have Iowa at UCLA in a sneaky good game because both teams kind of riding some positive momentum. Iowa coming off a huge defeat against Wisconsin this past weekend. UCLA got a road win against Nebraska, which a month or so ago would have thought that was ridiculous. But UCLA, even though they're only 3-5, a lot more, they've improved a lot more than I really ever thought they would. I thought they'd be in the same kind of boat as Purdue all season long, but they've shown their ability to improve. And there is kind of a case for Deshaun Foster to be given a little more time than maybe some initially thought. I still think he's probably not going to be the long-term answer for UCLA, and I'm sure there's a group of UCLA fans that would agree with that. But hey, I'm glad they got to be the first victim of, when it comes to the Big Ten, at least, of for the Indiana Hoosiers. But I think Iowa will win this game. I think it'll be close. The spread's 6.5. I think that's pretty on the money. If I were just assuming, I'm not going to pick a score or anything. I don't really do that. But I think Iowa will find a way to win this game. And again, they're favored, so maybe that's not really that big of a stretch. But it has been tough for teams to go on the road, especially for when it comes to the Midwest teams going out to the West Coast and vice versa. I mean, it's not like it's impossible. There have been teams that have done it, Indiana being one of them, Penn State being the other. There may even be some more examples that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. I think Minnesota was able to beat UCLA on the road, if I'm not mistaken. So Iowa may be the next to do so, or maybe UCLA gets a big win, because UCLA beating Iowa would be a big deal, I feel like. Because Iowa, even though they've had a few slip-ups this year, they're kind of the upper level of the mid-tier of the Big Ten, I feel like. Like they're like just a step below the Indianas, Penn States, Ohio States, and Oregon's, of course. I feel like I've got a belch trying to escape my body if it seems like I'm uncomfortable. I don't know. This has been the uncomfortable show of the week, right? Sometimes it happens. I've enjoyed doing it, but I feel like I just can't get physically comfortable in a position where I can just sit back and enjoy talking about all this stuff, because I'm constantly worried about what my body is trying to do at the moment. So my apologies if it's distracting. Hopefully we'll get back on, avoid this next Monday. But hey, we keep pushing forward. So let's move into the Saturday slate. We've got Purdue at number 2, Ohio State at noon on Fox. I mean, Ohio State favored by 38 points. I don't think that's completely out of the realm of possibility. And I mean, we've seen very few flashes of what Purdue can be with Ryan Brown, I believe, as their new quarterback. I mean, I'm sure Ohio State will dominate this game, but I don't particularly know whether or not covering is in the cards. Maybe it is. And that was almost a Hudson Card pun. If Hudson Card were to be strolled out and be Purdue's quarterback, I doubt that'll be the case. But I'm sure Ohio State will handle business here. Covering, I don't know, but there's no reason Ohio State should have any issues with the Boilermakers. Not really any reason for any team to have an issue with the Boilermakers, unless you are, of course, Illinois in the second half. But on at the same time, we have Minnesota at Rutgers on NBC. Two teams that, again, kind of in that middle tier of the Big Ten. Rutgers has kind of been reeling as of late. I believe, have they lost 4 in a row? I see they're 4-4. I remember they had a really hot start to the season. Yeah, they've lost 4 in a row. So they began the season. They won 44-7 against Howard, 49-17 against Akron, 26-23 against Virginia Tech. And then they have not won since a 21-18 victory at home against Washington. Since then, they lost 14-7 at Nebraska, 42-7 against Wisconsin, 35-32 against UCLA, and then 42-20 against USC. So a reeling Rutgers squad going up against Minnesota, who is, again, kind of on that same level as Iowa. But again, Iowa maybe just a notch ahead of them. I do believe Iowa and Minnesota have played, and I think Iowa, that was the Floyd of Rosedale Trophy, right? I think Iowa handled Minnesota fairly easily back when that matchup took place. It is on the road. Rutgers has a pretty decent home environment, especially these days under Greg Schiano. But it wouldn't surprise me to see Minnesota go on the road. They are favored by 6. Wouldn't surprise me if they win. I don't know that they cover. I could see it being closer than 6 points. But I do like Minnesota on the road. Shout out to PJ Fleck for really kind of turning his team around. I believe they're kind of the opposite of Rutgers. They had a really slow start to their year, but I believe they've rattled off several wins in a row. Yeah, they've won 4 in a row. Their streak dates back to their big win against USC, 24-17. Then they went on the road at UCLA, as I mentioned earlier, won 21-17. Then they dismantled Maryland 48-23, and then won on the road at Illinois. I believe that was last week, 25-17. And yes, that Iowa game that I mentioned they played, and they did lose that 31-14. So interesting stories for both of those teams as they face each other. It'd be interesting to see if Rutgers can steal back momentum and get a big win against the Gophers. And let's move into Michigan, Indiana. And I know I've talked about this game already, especially with Jordan. Shout out to him once again for coming on today's show. But this is the game I'm betting on from the Big Ten. And I've shied away from betting on Indiana. Not a ton this year. I mean, more so than most teams, just because I don't like to add stake to a game that I already have emotional stake in, But I think there's enough objective data, and I've heard it from enough people who have no rooting interest in the Hoosiers that think this 14.5 spread is easy money for Indiana to make. And why can't it be, right? We've seen Indiana dominate teams night in and night out when they played. And yeah, it wouldn't be surprising if if Michigan is able to kind of use their roster to their advantage, I'll say, and make this game closer than it should be. But here's something that really just keeps me here's a stat that should maybe make you a little more confident in whether or not Indiana can take care of business here. Michigan, I believe, is scoring 21 points a game. Let me see how they're doing. This is something I like to pull up. This is something I use whenever Indiana was facing Nebraska. What has Michigan done against Power 4 opponents? So against Texas, they only put up 12. USC, they put up 27. Minnesota, they put up 27. Washington, 17. Illinois, 7. Jeez, forgot about that game. 24 against Michigan State, and then 17 against Oregon. So very similar to whenever Indiana faced Nebraska. Michigan has not gotten past that 27-point mark, and for Nebraska, it was 28. And Nebraska probably played a softer schedule at that point, too. So if Indiana plays like Indiana, I don't see any reason. I bet they'll hold Michigan to around their 21 points per game. Maybe less. Oh, maybe that sounds cocky, but I don't see. One thing I talked about earlier this week I think it was this week with Mitchell. Urban Meyer mentioned whenever he was looking at the way that Indiana runs their offense that if it's executed properly, and I believe Kurt Cignetti has this team in line to where they're kind of programmed. That might not be the best way to say it. They're programmed to run this thing like it is a machine. And I don't see Michigan really, especially, I don't even know if I mentioned this today, 2 of Michigan's starting corners, one of them being Will Johnson, one of the biggest NFL prospects really in the country, are questionable to play this weekend. Doesn't mean they won't play, but they might not. But if they're not playing, especially, I don't see Michigan having enough to stop this high-powered Indiana offense. And again, we've seen Cignetti. He does not let off the gas. So I think Indiana minus 14.5 is a comfortable play. Hopefully I'm correct. I said almost said hopefully I'm wrong, but that's not what I want to say. Hopefully I'm correct in that manner. But I am putting my money where my mouth is and betting on the Hoosiers to cover this weekend. So hopefully they not only get the win, but add to that as well by getting the betting victory. Couple more Big Ten games, and then I'll share what else I've got when it comes to the rest of the slate, and then we'll get into some non-revenue shout-outs. Starting off here with the last 2 Big Ten games, Maryland at number 1 Oregon. Again, Maryland team that had a decent start to the year. The wheels just kind of fell off a little bit, and now, things aren't looking too hot for the Terps. 4-4, 1-4 in the Big Ten, going against a red-hot Oregon team. On the road, 24.5-point dogs. Wouldn't be surprised if the Ducks take care of business there and even cover, especially with the travel going all the way out to the West Coast for Maryland. And then we've got Washington at number 6, Penn State. Penn State going to be trying to bounce back from their loss, to Ohio State a week ago. And I will say this, if you're Indiana, you probably want to be pulling for I mean, do you want to pull for the Washington upset? Maybe it doesn't necessarily matter. Maybe for potential tiebreaker purposes. And plus, Indiana doesn't face Penn State, so it doesn't necessarily matter what they do. But I will say with one thing with the college football playoff rankings and Penn State getting more love than Indiana, I almost want to see Penn State lose to a Washington. That's a common opponent, right? You'd rather see Washington, get a big win against Penn State because you demolished Washington with your backup quarterback. So you probably want to be rooting for Washington here if you are an Indiana fan. I do think Penn State will probably win. I don't know if they'll cover. They're 13.5-point favorites. That game's on Peacock late at 8 o'clock. So that could be an interesting matchup, though, to keep an eye on. Because Washington's a hard team to kind of figure out because they'll put up more yards than you and still find a way to lose the game, which is one of the weirder stats with teams you have this year in the Big Ten. All right, that does it for the conference slate. And I'm going to go ahead and share a few of the other picks that I've got. I'm not gonna break down these, but and I'm not even gonna let you know how I parlay them. This is the other kind of picks I like for the week. UConn -6.5. I believe they're against UAB. Ole Miss money line against. I wish I had the actual matchup. Some of these I don't have who they're playing against. Who's Ole Miss got this week? This is wonderful. I almost said radio, but this isn't radio. Georgia. Yeah, so Ole Miss coming off their big weekend against they had a massive win against Arkansas, I believe, last week. And I think they're going to double down on that and upset Georgia, who struggled against Florida this past weekend. I like Iowa State -2.5, bouncing back from their loss. They got Kansas on the road. I like Army -3.5 against North Texas. JMU -16.5. I don't remember their opponent off the top of my head. Texas Tech money line against Colorado. I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just a Colorado hater, but I think Texas Tech, I think they're coming off their win against Iowa State, and maybe I'm just predicting they'll double down and knock off the Buffaloes. Yeah, they're the team that beat Iowa State. So that's why I'm taking Texas Tech money line. Tennessee -24.5. They are taking on, who do I have? They got Mississippi State, probably the worst team in the SEC. And Tennessee, it's been a bit since they've really demolished a team, and I think we're going to see that change. And then rounding things out, Arizona State -2.5. And now, again, I'm trying to see who, almost at the Pac-12, trying to see who they're going up against once again. And some of you guys are like, man, he doesn't even know who these teams are playing. Why is he betting on them? Well, I looked at all these last night, and I only just marked down what I was taking, not necessarily who they're playing against. They're playing UCF, and I just feel like Arizona State, I think that 2.5 is easy to do, especially when they're at home, team traveling like UCF. So those are the rest of my picks. Fade them, tail them, do whatever you want, ignore them. That's another option. And, we'll go and move on from that. And get into our final little bit of today's show, and that is non-revenue shout-outs. Since we didn't get to do these on Wednesday, this is where I kind of mentioned some of the sports that don't get as much attention for Indiana as the big names like football and men's basketball. Starting off with men's soccer. Unfortunate for them. They've had a hell of a run the last really month plus, really kind of getting back into the national conversation and then finding a way to win the Big Ten regular season. They faced Michigan in their opening round of the Big Ten tournament last night, or yesterday afternoon, I should say, and unfortunately fell to the Wolverines 1-0. So they will await their fate in the NCAA tournament and hopefully make another deep run to potentially make another College Cup appearance. So a loss in the Big Ten tournament doesn't mean that they are toast, but it is unfortunate given the way things were going heading into that portion of the season. Let's move into women's volleyball real quick. They are currently riding a 3-match winning streak. I believe last time we checked in with them, they were coming off a 3-0 win against Northwestern. Since then, they defeated Rutgers on the road 3-1, Maryland on the road 3-0. And then coming up this weekend, they will try to get revenge against their rival Purdue, number 9 ranked Purdue, by the way, at home. That'll be tonight at 7 o'clock. And then on Sunday, the second game in a homestand, they'll face number 20 USC. So 2 big opportunities for women's volleyball to get some marquee victories at this point in the season. And I don't know if the NCAA tournament is necessarily something that they can achieve at this point, but either way, if they can take some momentum into the final portion of the regular season schedule, that can only be a good thing. And then rounding out the non-revenues, and honestly, I hate to refer to women's basketball these days as a non-revenue because I believe that whenever things are rolling for women's basketball, I mean, they are a revenue generator. They've shown that the last several seasons. But they kicked off their season, or tipped off their season, I should say, earlier this week, just like men's basketball did. They began with an 82-60 victory over Brown. But here's the kicker. Here's where things went a little bit wrong. Last night, they lost, unfortunately, to Harvard, 72-68. And this is just going to be probably life without some of Indiana's former stars like Mackenzie Holmes. Adjusting to life without those players. Obviously, last year they were without Grace Berger as well. But even Terry Morin said this last night, I believe, that this is just not the same team. And not that is meant to be taken as an insult, but like it's going to take a bit for things to, adjusting to this new reality, I guess. Like we talked about this with men's basketball. Life without Trace Jackson Davis. For Purdue, what's life going to be like without Zach Edey? When you lose generational talent, especially the way that the women's basketball team has lost guys, or players, I should say, girls, like Mackenzie Holmes, and then Grace Berger before that, it's going to be tough to replace that and get that sort of, that level of production from somebody else. And hopefully they're able to bounce back. They have next Wednesday, they'll have Butler on the road. It says the TV for that is Flow Sports. Never heard of Flow Sports, but that's how you can watch that game. And with that, I think we're going to go and wrap up today's episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports. And appreciate you sticking around, and look forward to doing the Indiana football postgame wrap-up show tomorrow evening. Again, hopefully we're celebrating a 10th win and 0 losses for the Indiana Hoosiers football team. So until then, appreciate you checking this out. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube. Check out all the good things being written on HoosierIllustrated.com. And until this weekend and Monday, this has been another episode of In Touch with Indiana Sports, powered by HoosierIllustrated.com.